Okay, I think we're about ready to get started here. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Kuhulan Kelly, and I am a consultant at the United Nations Environment Program based out of Paris. Welcome to our webinar. This is the webinar that we are hosting through the 10YFP Sustainable Public Procurement Program on the US EPA's draft guidelines for environmental performance standards and Ecolabels, its response to comments and next steps. And with us today, we have Allison Bennett from the US EPA. Before we get started on the content of the webinar, I would just like to take a minute or two to orient you to the GoToWebinar webinar tool. You will see on the dashboard that is a part of the GoToWebinar tool that you are automatically muted, as is everybody else who is an attendee at this meeting. Don't worry, that's completely normal. If you have a comment or a question, I ask that you please leave it until the end. If you have an urgent question that you don't want to forget, there's a question box down at the bottom of your control panel where you can enter these questions. And then once we get to the question and answer session, there should be a button on your control panel that enables you to raise your hand, and that will enable myself and Allison, our other presenter, to unmute you and let you ask your question. Just letting everybody know, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available online after this session, both on the SCP Clearinghouse, which is scpclearinghouse.org, as well as on the YouTube channel for the 10-year framework of programs, the 10YFP. So, without much more to do, we've had an excellent turnout for this webinar. In fact, we're unfortunately at capacity for this webinar, which is very exciting for us, but somewhat unfortunate for the people who are unable to join, that they will be able to watch afterwards since we are recording. Let me just give you a little bit of background before we hop into the content of the EPA presentation. The 10-year framework of programs, Sustainable Public Procurement Program, initially started its work back in 2005 as the Marrakesh Task Force on SPP, which started in Buenos Aires, and then that was built upon by the Sustainable Public Procurement Initiative, which started in 2012, and that was founded in Rio. The Sustainable Public Procurement Initiative gave these goals and objectives that you are looking at right now. And it also developed the work plan of the 10YFP Sustainable Public Procurement Program. The 10YFP Sustainable Public Procurement Program was officially launched this past April, and we've been operating with these goals and objectives you see here. The main goal of the 10YFP SPP program is to promote worldwide implementation of SPP through increased cooperation between key stakeholders and a better understanding of its potential benefits and impacts. One of the ways that we see to increase collaboration and improve understanding of these benefits and impacts is through webinars such as these, where we can share learning and experiences such as those of the United States EPA with a global audience such as yourselves. The two objectives of the SPP program are to, one, build the case for SPP by improving the knowledge on SPP and its effectiveness as a tool to promote greener economies and sustainable development, and two, to support the implementation of SPP on the ground through increased collaboration and improved coordination between SPP stakeholders. Next slide, please. The 10YFP Sustainable Public Procurement Program currently has 74 partners as of this month, December 2014, and our regional spread can be seen here. If you are interested in joining this global network, which has as its core the goal of increasing implementation of SPP worldwide, please don't hesitate to contact me. Our contact information will be made available after this webinar. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier that the 10YFP Sustainable Public Procurement Program has a work plan that builds on the work plan of the Sustainable Public Procurement Initiative. And that work plan is made up of individual working groups, which are led by organizations outside of the United Nations Environment Program and are results oriented. They're based on deliverables. You can see before you the list of active working groups we have on sustainable public procurement. Among them, we work on monitoring and evaluating SPP implementation, looking at measuring impacts and communicating benefits. But the working group that through which this webinar is being hosted today is currently the working group 4B on supporting SPP implementation through the use of eco-labeling and sustainability standards. And that group has a number of deliverables, but among them is the goal of creating this global network of stakeholders that are interested in and active in supporting SPP through the implementation of eco-labeling and sustainability standards. And without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Allison Bennett from the United States Environmental Protection Agency to present the US EPA's draft guidelines for green standards and eco-labels. So take it away, Allison.
Thank you so much, Cahulan and Fareed and the rest of the UNEP gang. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here and your patience with us as we've rescheduled this. And hopefully, since you've all joined the first 101, that's the hardest part of the hour. I look forward to jumping right in here. I wanted to emphasize that this effort is focused on serving the U.S. federal government purchasers and meeting their environmentally preferable purchasing mandates through greater use of private sector standards and eco-labels. And the EPP program just celebrated its 21st birthday. I think some of you have been engaged with us since those early days. Others more recently have been heavily engaged in this particular effort over the past 4 years or so, either participating in our listening sessions, submitting comments, or calling me weekly to check in and see what's taking us so long. And then I know some of you are not quite sure what the US EPA is up to here, but we're intrigued by UNEP's invitation. So I welcome all of you, and I'll do my best to keep this interesting wherever you might fall in that spectrum of familiarity with the effort. However, if you've heard me present before or you're already familiar with the Environmentally Preferable Purchasing Program, feel free to turn down the volume and multitask or grab a cup of coffee until I get to slide 13. That's where we're really beginning into our recent response to comments on the guidelines and our plans for the pilot. So I'll try to wrap up my talk in 30 minutes or so, so there's time for questions and hopefully answers. Before I dive in, though, I want to make a long story short here and be clear about what we are essentially doing. And a big thank you to my colleague, Stephen Sylvan, for helping me boil this complex project down into this really an oversimplification. Really, the fun is in the devil's in the details here, but you'll see that we intend to provide a screen to go from the full universe of standards and eco-labels to get to a list of those that the U.S. government should consider putting our spending power behind for real impact in reductions of our spend. We recognize there have been many other quote-unquote standards for standards efforts, but in listening to purchasers and manufacturers, we agree that we really need to take it further in doing the assessments and providing the list. Otherwise, we expect that there would be many different interpretations of how to apply the guidelines and multiple lists of standards, and we wouldn't be much better off. So I'll come back to this and provide a more detailed schematic of what we're doing here, but I thought I'd start with there first to let you know what we're up to. So again, what makes a purchase environmentally preferable or sustainable? I certainly don't need to tell this audience that that question is complex. There's gaps in the science, there are environmental trade-offs, there can be trade-offs amongst environmental, social, and economic impacts. At times, our government policies and programs have been working at cross purposes. And so the point of this admittedly absurd Venn diagram is to say a multi-impact, multi-life cycle approach is ideal, and ignoring one element may result in a significant oversight. In answering the question, what makes a purchase environmentally preferable or sustainable? And this is really the perspective that our environmentally preferable purchasing program takes. When we were launched via executive order in 1993, I think this thinking was a bit ahead of its time, and we're really excited that it's coming into the common nomenclature of this space. Our premise is that purchasers drive the economy and thus can transform the marketplace towards sustainability. But EPA recognizes that the foundation for all of this work and for the sustainable purchase needs to be improved access to supply chain data and improved scientific methodologies to bring together life cycle assessment, risk assessment, and other tools to formulate a clearer picture of what is sustainable and how that data and tools alone cannot drive transformational change in the marketplace. And that's why our program is focused on this middle layer of this pyramid. We need standards and ecolabels and other mechanisms like them to translate the science at the foundation into actionable steps for purchasers and consumers. And so that's an orientation of where our focus has been. And the marketplace has responded with lots of messaging and many potential solutions via standards and ecolabels. And it's certainly challenging to know which are credible and effective. How is a purchaser to sort through all this complexity? Clearly, some of these standards and ecolabels look at one aspect of impact. Some look at one stage in a life cycle. Some are developed by NGOs, some by government, some by industry groups, some involve many interested stakeholders. Some are pass-fail, some recognize tiers of performance to provide both recognition and incentive for innovation and leadership, and an on-ramp for those new to sustainability. Some are expensive, some are relatively inexpensive for manufacturers. Some standards aren't associated with an eco-label. Some are local, some are national, some are international. Some incorporate others by reference or establish systems that are interoperable and or offer mutual recognition. Some address issues, the same issues in different ways than their competitors, and some have transparent process and measurements of benefits, and others are less transparent or less advanced in their ability to measure impact. Some verification systems include on-site visits, some allow for self-declaration, and some balance both approaches based upon the risk of noncompliance. And I say all of these trends and characteristics, none of these characteristics are inherently wrong or right in all situations. But clearly, again, it's difficult for a purchaser to sort through all this complexity. If you're interested in more about these trends, I've recently participated in a really very insightful ICL two-part series on trends and sustainability standards. I'd highly recommend you can go to their website and download those. In the United States federal government, we have clarified some aspects of sustainable purchasing. We want to harness the U.S. government's close to $500 billion in annual purchasing power towards these specific goals. And on the left here, you see that many of these goals came together. Some of them have been around for 30 or so years. They've come together under Presidential Executive Order 13514. And we, our program, in red there, the Environmentally Preferable Purchasing Program, this is where we're targeting at a greater clarity on what does that term mean. I've also included here a link to the sftool.gov/green procurement, where you can search by most every purchase category important to the federal government spend and find out, is there a mandate associated with that? What is the particular environmental requirement? I also wanted to include for this audience, since sustainability is that three-legged stool, the U.S. federal government has a number of socioeconomic sustainability mandates. They're not linked under one executive order, but we're enjoying the opportunity to work with our colleagues in the Department of State and elsewhere that are working on Small Business Administration, that are working on these issues and seeing how we can combine efforts. So the environmentally preferable purchasing program, with its focus on standards, um, has been influencing the technical rigor of numerous private sector sustainable product and service standards for, I would say, the past 12 years or so is really where we shifted to working via voluntary consensus standards primarily. And we do that because we're required as a federal government through the National Technology Transfer and Advancement Act and OMB A119 to both participate in and use private sector standards in our procurement and in our regulations, by the way. So we've enjoyed the opportunity to sit around a table, sometimes for years, with multiple stakeholders and experts trying to define what is environmentally preferable for these particular purchase categories. And you see there on the right the standards organizations we've worked with. Even in these cases where the federal government has been heavily engaged in influencing, we've not been able to widely encourage the use of these standards and eco-labels because we've needed the criteria for saying why this one and not that one. So clearly our staff could not be participating in the 400 plus standards and eco-labels out there, so we don't have that direct knowledge about all of them. So enter the guidelines. Tune back in if you want to get a cup of coffee or turn down the volume. This is where I'll dive into a bit more about the guidelines for standards and eco-labels. So our goal has been and continues to be a transparent, fair, and consistent and results-oriented approach to selecting product environmental performance standards and eco-labels for federal procurement. The guidelines are broken into 4 sections, and they're based on the integrity and development of the development and management process based on ISO and ISEAL good practices and protocols, and also the effectiveness of the criteria itself. Does it support the claim of environmental preferability? The guidelines provide a cross-sector framework that is flexible to address product category-specific needs and differences. It provides a government-wide approach and recognizes that there is emerging market capacity for the job of assessing standards and eco-labels. More on that in a minute. So we were really fortunate to receive really significant constructive feedback from November to April from these 80 or so commenters. And essentially our charge is to ensure that the guidelines from these commenters is that the guidelines and the assessment process should be dynamic, objective, defensible, anti-monopolistic, easy to understand, up-to-date, results-driven, replicable, financially sustainable, and internationally operable. So quite an assignment we have. We're taking it very seriously and hope you see that in our response to comments. So more specifically, what did we hear during that comment period from those 80 commenters? We had a number of questions around the role of government. Is this an appropriate quote-unquote intervention of government or role for the government? And you'll see in our response to comments on our website, we wanted to explain not only the NTT and OMB Circular A119 and why we're participating in the development of standards and eco-labels and why we're directed to use them, but also describe a bit more about the varying programmatic authorities and approaches that EPA and other federal agencies have. Some programs set the floor about environmental performance baselines. Others identify top performers, and we think that there's room for both types to be recognized by the guidelines. EPA is not alone in this effort. We have certain authorities we're working and expertise. We're working with GSA, Department of Defense, the U.S. Trade Representative, and also the National Institute of Standards and Technology and the Federal Trade Commission. We all bring different perspectives and important contributions to this effort, and we really value the partnerships there. We had a number of questions and needed to clarify more what we meant by baseline and leadership guidelines. We were intending with baseline to align with federal goals and requirements, and then designating certain criteria that were relatively straightforward to evaluate and we think are applicable across industry sectors. Those guidelines were indicated as baseline. We indicated other guidelines as leadership because we think that they represent best practices and are currently achievable by some standards and eco-labels, but maybe not others. And we needed to determine we'll need to determine the applicability of the leadership guidelines to standards and eco-labels on a purchase category by purchase category basis, and that's a key thing we're testing in the pilot, as I'll share. Finally, a general theme that we responded to was this: do we have the right balance in the guidelines between criteria focused on the substance of the standard versus the integrity of the process? And both are critically important to the federal government. As we say in our response to comments, EPA has decided to first focus on environmental and health effectiveness guidelines per our mission. And we will also consider the procedural guidelines, those sections 1, 3, and 4, consistent with the yet to be finalized OMB Circular A119, which is really the standard policy for the federal government. We made a number of changes to section 2 of the guidelines regarding environmental effectiveness. And we expect there'll be more changes as we learn in the pilot and learn from the pilot. So with regard to alignment with relevant standards, we've clarified that alignment with relevant standards does not only mean including the same concepts, but also being consistent with relevant standards rigor. With regard to significant measurable difference, we've clarified that levels of the standard or eco-label's performance should be higher than the legal minimum or industry average. Again, we're looking for environmentally preferable. Performance versus prescriptive criteria. So we needed to do some work to clarify the terms here and explain conditions under which really each are quote, quite could very well be appropriate. And we think that there's room for both performance and prescriptive-based criteria in the standards and eco-labels the federal government wants to use. With regard to multi-attribute life cycle approaches and hotspots, lots of changes here, lots of fun conversation came through in the comments here. We've clarified the terms again and acknowledged an exception for standards and eco-labels that do not address the finished product. For example, sustainable forestry standards and others that look at process and production methods. And we recognized that there was an intended sort of bias towards those finished products and how we had framed the initial draft of the guidelines. So thank you for those comments. With regard to chemical ingredient disclosure, we here reiterated the importance of transparency to a functioning sustainable marketplace and continue to encourage standards to include such criteria. And with regard to intrinsic hazards, we clarified terms regarding risk versus hazard-based approach, and we are describing a range of government approaches and where and when EPA uses each approach and how they're both critically important. So back to our nifty oversimplification, just to remind you what we're doing here, and not so easy graphic to get through, but let me try because this is sort of the framework which we're going forward with the pilot. So for those of you that like detail, again, on the upper right-hand corner, EPA is going to continue to rely upon our federal partners for advice and policy, and certainly in the implementation phase if we get there. And then we certainly will be referring back to the public comments that need to be further fleshed out via the pilot. We're looking forward to bringing together a team of contractors to help us pull this off, hopefully in the very, very near future. And that contracting team would really convene the experts and the stakeholders needed to translate the guidelines, which are cross-sector, into purchase category-specific checklists. That could be the assessment tool to assess standards and eco-labels in particular purchase categories by. We are proposing to move forward in this pilot with furniture, flooring, and building paints, coatings, and removers as the initial purchase categories by which we would test the guidelines, and these were all chosen for a number of reasons I'll get into in a second. We're also leaving room for potential to be determined if there's resources available. And also, in response to significant interest and comments that came in, we recognize that there's not only significant federal impact in the federal spend related to the services we procure, but also a growing number of standards and eco-labels in that space. And the guidelines were written for products, but we think that it's worth exploring if and how they can be augmented or edited to address service sector standards as well. So, the pilot. The criteria for selecting those pilot categories thus far, and we would apply this also if we move into a fourth or fifth or sixth in the future. We see that these categories have potentially significant environmental or human health impact. We've done spend analyses in the federal government, and they each provide that opportunity for environmental or human health improvement. In particular, we recognize that there's private sector standards that speak to those impacts in the supply chain that we want to begin to rely upon. We also know that the government buys a lot of that stuff, which is important. And also important, we recognize that the current federal sustainable acquisition mandates in those categories are either limited in their scope, maybe out of date due to lack of resources to keep them up to date in the federal government, or they could be augmented with the private sector standards. So our goals with the pilot, in a nutshell, are to further refine the guidelines and to test the long-term feasibility of these multi-stakeholder panels, working with independent assessors to accomplish the goals of assessing and providing an initial set, at least, of recognized standards for federal environmentally preferable purchasing. We also want to answer some key questions. We haven't got it all figured out clearly. So here are just a sampling of those things that we will look to the pilot and lean on our contracting team's expertise to help us answer, and then some of these really require the federal government to huddle after the pilot and figure out what we do next. So we're curious, as I know many of you are, as came through in the public comments, what are the vulnerabilities of different standards development models for both environmental performance and the integrity of the process? How, if and how, actually, should we distinguish amongst those conforming standards? We expect that some standards will demonstrate more in terms of the leadership guidelines than others. Do we convey that to purchasers, or do we keep a simple sort of pass-fail list for federal purchasers? How do we address categories where both single life cycle stage or environmental impact issues and multi-life cycle stage, multi-environmental impact issues exist? Again, I went through those different trends and recognize that there's both of these out there, and we don't want to assume that one is always preferable than another. How will international equivalence be determined? We recognize that we don't have all of the standards we need here in North America potentially, and want to look more broadly and consider the potential international trade issues that arise. We also will be asking the question at the end of the pilot, is the pilot result implementable, or is it just a bunch of really helpful learnings and we start over? So I want you to know that we aren't assuming that what we get at the end of the pilot will become a recognized list that will become integrated into sustainable acquisition systems for the federal government. We're clearly interested in a time of diminishing federal funds, if the pilot can demonstrate that an external effort can sustain itself. We're also curious, how often do we need to put standards and eco-labels through these assessments? How often do we need to reassess? And these questions of what are these inherently governmental functions that we cannot outsource? What aspects of this work should EPA or other agencies or the broader federal government retain quote-unquote control over? We are asking the question, do these remain EPA-owned guidelines in perpetuity? It's a question we want to help resolve through the pilot and then some follow-on conversations with our federal family. So the timeline, on December 1st, we posted our response to comments. We hope also this year we can issue an RFP to test that implementation approach and bring together a contracting team. 2015 is the target for the pilot. We don't want this thing to go on and on forever. Let's put our resources into putting our head down and getting this work done in 2015 so that in 2016 we can consider implementation of the recognized standards in federal procurement. We will be, again, relying on a number of our experts in the federal sector to help us determine if and how to incorporate standards into federal procurement systems. And these last three items really, again, are just one potential scenario where we would begin to pull them into the SF tool, green procurement compilation, the GSA Advantage, and other federal procurement systems. We would hope that federal agencies would get the word and begin to specify these standards and ecolabels in their contracts, and additional purchase categories could be addressed if we see success here. And certainly, the broad goal is that there's going to be consistent use of these private sector standards and ecolabels to meet our mandates, and we can begin to really have better measurement of our environmental impacts based upon the criteria and the standards we know are being specified. So that is my spiel, and I look forward to entertaining your questions. And I'll leave this slide up so that you can know where to find our more detailed response to comments, more information about the sustainable acquisition mandates brought together under Executive Order 13514, more about U.S. policy on standards, which I think we're unique here amongst the international community. And there's my contact information. Feel free to give me a phone call or send me an email. So let's go ahead and open the line for questions. Colin.
First of all, thank you very much, Allison, for that excellent presentation. I personally feel like I just had an excellent snapshot at the landscape that the U.S. federal government is dealing with in terms of sustainability standards and how to incorporate that into federal procurement. Thank you very much for that. So we have scheduled 1 hour for this webinar, and it is currently 36 minutes past. So from now until the end, we can have a question and answer session. I'd like to remind all attendees of this webinar that in order to ask a question, you have two ways. You can either, one, write it in the question box down at the bottom of your GoToWebinar control panel, or you can raise your hand and wait for myself or Allison to unmute you so that you can ask your question. And we'll switch back and forth between asking questions from the question box or from the raised hands. But to get us started off here, a question for you, Allison, comes from Jovana Milik. And the question is, how were the chosen criteria determined or measured? And could you elaborate a little bit more on the process of selection of the product categories for the pilot? You touched on that on one of your earlier slides, but there you go.
Sure. I think the first part is how were the guidelines developed, and I'll get into that a little bit. It was a number of years in development. We looked to the marketplace to see what standards were out there. We looked to ISO standards and protocols, ANSI essential requirements, ISEALs, good practice guides, and credibility principles and other codes. We've also just looked to our own government standards and eco-labels in terms of what was effective and the processes that they undertake to return results. And when we had compiled the guidelines, we tested them in an initial feasibility study where we looked at about 9 private sector standards and eco-label organizations and had them fill out a survey translating the initial set of guidelines into questions. And we also tested the government standards and eco-labels. And those learnings resulted in the next iterations of the guidelines. In terms of the second question, the criteria that went into selecting those purchase categories for pilot, flooring, furniture, and paints, coatings, and removers, you can imagine we had a longer list that a number of things maybe were not ripe in some of the other categories due to other activities either the federal government had going on or private sector standards and eco-labels were just being developed in certain categories, and we didn't think that we wanted to put them on the spot in a pilot next year. So we've honed in on these building product categories at this stage, again, because they do show up in life cycle assessment, risk assessment, and in terms of impact in federal spend, and where we know that there are private sector standards and eco-labels that can augment the current federal mandates to improve our environmental performance in those spend categories. Next.
Okay, thank you for that. I see a couple of hands raised, and I'm going to go now to a hand raised from Peter Norstedt. So I'm going to unmute you, Peter.
So, thank you. Can you hear me?
Indeed, we can.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Perfect. Hi, Allison, and thank you for a very interesting presentation and a very interesting project. I have a few questions on labels, as we also have been working with labels as one tool that can be used for sustainable procurement. How do you look at the market, what they can provide regarding standards and labels? Because what I see, the public goods and services commonly bought by the public is not always the same as what you can find on the eco-label market, for instance, because it's more focused on private consumption. So how do you look at the market, and how do you know they can actually provide a good portfolio of goods and services that could actually be labeled, or could it also be a possibility to comply with the criteria beneath the label system or the standard without actually having the label? And how do you foresee the updating of this system and the funding? How do you see any? How would you will finance the future updating of this system? Because I think that's quite a critical issue. Thank you.
Okay, I needed to make myself a note so I didn't forget any of your questions. So let me start with this question of, do private sector standards and eco-labels meet the needs of the types of goods and services that federal agencies and public procurement needs? Certainly there's a lot of similarity and a lot of difference. Some of our more unique military needs may not have standards or eco-labels out there to support them, and thus this is not a solution for all of our sustainability opportunities or environmental challenges in our procurement. And your point regarding do we need an eco-label? Can we specify to the standard or the underlying criteria? Definitely something we're very interested in. We are not suggesting that the products or services that the federal government buys would necessarily need to be third-party certified in all cases. We recognize the role of self-declaration to criteria. We recognize the role of specifying to standards without having to specify to a certain certification procedure or verification procedure. However, we want to take that on a case-by-case basis, product category by product category, maybe even attribute by attribute basis, given the risk of non-compliance Is it significant enough to incur the additional costs of certification? Sometimes the answer will be yes. And with regard to financing the maintenance of guidelines and assessment of standards and eco-labels, that is certainly an issue that we recognize. Not only is it a funding issue for the federal government, it's also an issue of sort of expertise and capacity and credibility of the effort. We recognize that there's growing market capacity and the need to engage multiple stakeholders in translating these guidelines and continuing to evolve these guidelines so that they can better be suited to assess particular purchase categories as standards and eco-labels. And so the pilot will be putting a charge out there to see if this effort can be self-sustaining with government participation, certainly as an expert and as a key stakeholder, but maybe not as the full funder in the long run. Okay?
Thank you for that, Allison. I'm going to go over to a question and a hand raised that we see from Jerry Schwartz. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you now, Jerry. Jerry, you are unmuted, so feel free to ask your question to Allison. Jerry, are you there? Well, in any case, Jerry fortunately wrote his question into the questions box, and it said, now that you have candidate, excuse me, Allison, now that you have candidate products for pilots, can you describe in more detail how it will work? For example, for furniture, which standards will be looked at by the team? Who will likely be on the team? Have you contacted stakeholders in that industry? And does it include all kinds of furniture, wood, plastic, steel, etc.?
Great. I sort of glossed over some of that detail, and happy to have the opportunity to go into that a little bit more. So we'll be issuing a notice in the Federal Register, which is the main mechanism that the U.S. federal government communicates opportunities to the public. We'll be seeking volunteers. So no product standard or eco-label would be assessed unless they wanted to be assessed. And that's how we envision this moving forward, because it will require some time and effort on the part of the respondents and the standards and eco-labels. And so that's the first part. We get a pool of interested, in this case, furniture standards and eco-labels to say, raise their hands and say, assess me. We are also putting out for public comment the criteria for panel members. We have a proposed set on our website under the pilot page, and we're interested in feedback regarding the characteristics and expertise needed for panel members. We're envisioning a consensus type process to take these guidelines and develop these more detailed standard for standards or checklists or assessment tools to assess the standards and eco-labels. And that we think is probably best to be kept around 9 to 11. I'm not quite sure yet. We haven't set a number of how many panel members, but certainly there'll be opportunity for input on the criteria. So I think that covers much of the questions. Thanks, Jerry.
Yeah, I'd say so. Thank you for that. So we've got a number of questions coming in via the question box. Here's one from Karen Schmidt, and the question is, how will the EPA ensure that innovative new sustainability standards can be promptly considered and, quote, added to the list, while problem standards, e.g. standards where the development process becomes closed, unbalanced, or biased and loses market and stakeholder support, are promptly removed from the list? Can you give that question a go, Allison?
Yeah. Well, I encourage you to take a look at our guidelines. We think that things wouldn't be added to the list that exhibited some of the characteristics you laid out there in the first place. And then it will certainly be a challenge. Some of these sectors are fast moving with updates to standards happening often. And I think the guidelines are already having some impact in those standards development and eco-label development conversations, which is a great thing. So part of the pilot charge will be to help us determine how frequently panels are brought together to assess if a new standard comes into the sector, or if a standard is significantly revised and the organization says, look at me again, I think I could conform to the guidelines at this stage. We'll need to just see how well fine-tuned a machine these guidelines and the assessment process can be to address those needs.
Okay, thank you for that, Allison. Just giving everybody a heads up, we're at 10 minutes more of a Q&A session. We'll continue this for about another 8 minutes, I would say, and then wrap up from there. Right now, I'm going to go over to a hand raised I see from Heather Vickery. I'm going to unmute you now. Hello, Heather. Go ahead and ask your question to Allison. Heather, can you hear us? Okay, perhaps Heather didn't mean to raise her hand. In any case, we have another question coming in from Archie Beaton, and the question is, will pulp, paper, and packaging be a focus soon? And perhaps we can expand on that question and say, will other product areas be added to the pilot? You had mentioned something of a TBD.
Yeah, we're certainly interested in where stakeholders feel that they want an opportunity to have their sector assessed and tested via the pilot. And as you can imagine, paper is a significant opportunity for federal purchasing, and something that we've been working on for a very long time, and we know that there are private sector standards. So it could fall into that TBD category, but no plans at this stage.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to throw you a curveball now, coming from the question box, and it comes from Vanessa Dick, and the question is, it's a two-part. It's a comment and a question. The prioritization process still seems quite skewed towards using the tool of life cycle assessment. You've made an exception by including toxicity risk assessment tools to prioritize chemical hazards, but because LCA is known to be inadequate to assess spatially explicit impact areas like water scarcity, biodiversity loss, and land use change, etc., how will you address those current vulnerabilities in your process?
Well, hopefully we'll get good experts like yourself to participate in the panels and help us determine first our edits needed to those guidelines. Our bias is still there that would prevent the federal government from utilizing robust, effective, credible standards. And so I hope that we're a little bit closer based on the good comments you've submitted, and would look forward to continuing those discussions. We recognize some of the limitations in the tools you described, and are hoping that this effort could provide a boost to some cross-dialogue amongst the various tools and seeing how they can better work together. And standards and eco-labels are the place to try these things out.
Okay, thank you for that. We've got another question coming in that says the following. Have you identified assessment approach and methods, especially for environmental and market impacts related to the implementation of proposed standards and labels? And if yes, could you share it, please? Okay, I'll let
Sorry,
you.
can you repeat the first part
Yeah,
again?
sorry. Have you identified approaches and methods to assessing the environmental and market impacts related to the implementation of proposed standards and labels? And how will that affect this pilot project?
Yeah, I think I understand the question to mean sort of if the federal government were to put significant purchasing power behind some standards and eco-labels and maybe not others, what sort of impact would that have on the market and the economy? Are there enough products to meet those standards? Are we disadvantaging small businesses? Other things that would come into the whole array of impacts on the marketplace and the economy. We've certainly had those issues top of mind. I don't have an economic analysis to provide. I think part, again, of the pilot is for us to first test, is this feasible? The listening sessions certainly in the public comment period, we think certainly encouraged us to move down this path for a number of not only environmental benefits, but also marketplace benefits, some assurance for manufacturers as to where to put their own dollars in changing their products or in certifying their products. And so it's a complex, really important question that we hope the pilot could help us elucidate a bit more.
Okay, thank you for that, Allison. And yeah, that was a complex question, I know. I think we've got time for about one more question and answer, and then we'll wrap it up here. But we just got a question coming in from Jeff Omelchuk, and it was, you spoke mostly of evaluating standards, and you also observed that conformity assessment is critical. IZEAL refers to, quote, standard systems. Does EPA plan to assess labels or conformity assessment processes as well as the standards themselves?
Right. We've noted in our guidelines that potentially certain aspects of the guidelines wouldn't be applicable. So in those cases where an eco-label may not be available or needed, where it's a standalone standard that could be specified to, that might suffice our needs. In other cases where a certain type of conformity assessment is determined to be necessary, those guidelines would kick in. And so we have guidelines related to eco-label program management and conformity assessments that, again, by a purchase category by purchase category conversation in the panels would determine if and how to apply them. So the answer is that, yes, I think the federal government is interested in both specifying to standards and specifying to standard systems. And if and where and when each approach makes most sense, we hope to learn more about in the pilot.
Okay, thank you for that.
And another perspective on that, just one more note on that is, again, remember we're coming at this from the perspective of making a purchaser's life easier. And so we want to recognize where we can provide the greatest clarity and sort of that easy button for federal purchasers wherever it makes sense.
Right. Well, thank you for that. And I think that I definitely applaud you for what seems to be an immense gargantuan effort that you and the environmentally preferable purchasing program at the EPA have done. Seems like you have had your hands full, to say the least, and will have your hands full over the course of this next calendar year with the pilots. and I think I can count at least 100 people who are interested in hearing how that goes. So thank you again, Allison, on behalf of UNEP and the 10YFP SPP program for making this excellent presentation to our international audience. I'd like to remind attendees that if you would like any more information on what Allison has presented, please feel free to contact her. We will be making this recording of this webinar publicly available on both YouTube and the SCP Clearinghouse. We will also be sharing the presentation. Can you confirm that, Allison?
Yes, and we'll also have this webinar linkable and the slides linkable from our website here at epa.gov/EPP/draft guidelines.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And if you go ahead, Allison.
I also wanted to offer to come back to this audience at 1 or 2 points next year and touch base about how things are going. I'm hoping many of you will be actively engaged participants, however.
I think that's a great idea. We're all on the edge of our seats over here. One more just small plug from the 10YFP SPP program. If you enjoyed this webinar, if you enjoyed learning from the experience of the US EPA, potentially somebody from not your organization and not even your continent, depending on where you're tuning in from, please feel free to contact fareed.yacker@unep.org to join the 10YFP SPP program. We plan on holding bi-monthly informational webinars such as these every 2 months. So thank you again for your participation, your excellent questions, and thank you again to Allison for setting this up with us.
Thank you all so much.
Okay, and with that, we will wish you a good day. Goodbye.